Hello, saints. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul writes, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, and also to the Greek. For in it, God's righteousness is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Now, this is important for us to understand, is that Paul is telling us that the entrance into this relationship with God is by faith. And to give us an idea that during the Reformation period, Martin Luther saw this, and he had some issues, because as a Roman Catholic monk, he understood God's righteousness, his justice, to be something that he hated, because he knew he was a sinner, and that he could never measure up to that righteousness. And so the only thing he saw was condemnation. Coming up against God, he had no way of winning, until finally, one day, he understood it. He understood that the righteousness or the justice of God is what gave the gospel power. And in that he understood God's righteousness, his justice, isn't against us. It was for us. And it allows the gospel to save us. And there, we're able to appropriate God's righteousness into our account by faith. By faith alone, we lay hold of that, and we have salvation. This is the thing that moved the Reformation into this light of the gospel, is we begin to understand that it's not by works that we're saved. That's why Paul can write later on in chapter 3, verse 20, that it's not by the deeds of the law is any man justified, but by the law is the knowledge of sin. At the end of chapter 3, after he gives us the gospel message, he tells us here in verse 27, where then is the boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By one of works? No, on the contrary, by a law of faith. For we can conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. So it's important to know that when we come into relationship with God, it is by faith, by believing and trusting in him, not by the things we do. There is nothing we can do on our own to commend ourselves to God. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't call for obedience, but that is the result of this relationship. It is the result of salvation. It is not the basis of it. It is not the cause of it. There is nothing we can do to commend ourselves to God except this great need that we have, the sin that we carry, that we bring to him at the cross. And by faith, we appropriate the cross, the effect of the cross, to ourselves. It's why Paul tells us later there in Romans chapter 3, when he talks about the crucifixion, and he tells us what the blood does for us. In chapter 3, 24 to 27 is the heart of it. And he tells us here that it says, they are justified freely by his grace, in verse 24, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. God presented him as a propitiation through faith in his blood, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his restraint, God had passed over the sins previously committed. But God presented him to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be righteous and declare righteous the one who has faith in Jesus. So God shows himself just at the cross, so he can justify those who would have faith in Jesus. And what he does is this cross is what justifies those into the past. And it's not talking about just your past, but all the way back to Adam and Eve. When they sinned, they became enemies of God. And it wasn't until the cross that God's justice was met on breaking that sin. In the beginning, Adam and Eve met mercy. Now was the time of justice. And that's what the cross does. And it shows that God was just and the justifier of those who would believe. Believe in Jesus. By faith, you are saved. Blessings.